Well, if there are no other questions about Innovation Ohio, what we'll do is go to the second part of the press conference that Dale will take us through.
Well, good morning, everybody, and I am Dale Butland. And let me say first that here at Innovation Ohio, we believe that facts are important, especially when it comes to enacting major legislation or making major changes to long-standing public policy. Given the impact that such changes have on people's lives, it's critical that government officials let facts, rather than opinions or ideology, guide their actions. Now, Innovation Ohio is well aware that the worst recession since the Great Depression has left Ohio, like most other states, with a large budget deficit. And though Ohio's deficit is far smaller than that of many other states, we know that closing it will require not just sacrifice, but also innovation and a willingness to rethink how government functions. Innovation Ohio does not oppose change. In fact, we embrace it. That's why we named our organization Innovation Ohio. But change in and of itself should not be the goal of public policy. After all, change can be bad as well as good. The content of change is what counts. Change that doesn't solve a problem, or that makes a problem even worse, is obviously not worth pursuing. Which brings us back to the importance of facts. And in our view, the facts don't support some of the policy initiatives now being pursued by the Ohio General Assembly and the Kasich administration. Take Senate Bill 5, for example, which effectively drives a stake through the heart of collective bargaining by Ohio's public workers, including teachers, police, and firefighters. Yes, we know that late last week, Senate President Niehaus announced that the conservative majority has magnanimously decided to let public workers retain the right to bargain collectively. But it would be a hollow shell of a right. No more bargaining for benefits, no more right to strike, no more binding arbitration for police, firefighters, or other public safety workers. So what's been proposed may be collective, but it's not bargaining. It's a dance where the outcome is known before the action or the bargaining begins. One side, the employer side, holds all the cards. The other side holds only the bag. For them, for the workers, the bottom line will always be take it or leave it. Now, the sponsors of Senate Bill 5 say that these changes are necessary to close the budget deficit and bring local government costs under control. But we believe the facts say otherwise. This morning, Innovation Ohio is releasing a study on the sweeping revision of the collective bargaining rights proposed for Ohio's teachers, and on the claims made by its supporters as to why the change is necessary. Before we get to the study's findings, it's important to note that while proponents initially cast Senate Bill 5 as being necessary to help close the state's $8 billion budget deficit, at the time it was first introduced, even its author, Senator Shannon Jones, could not say how much money her bill would save the state or localities, or even if it would save any money at all. Indeed, when she was asked that specific question on the day she introduced the bill, she reportedly replied, and I quote, "I have no idea." Since then, or more specifically, late last week, a report from the Kasich administration's Office of Collective Bargaining was apparently leaked, which claimed that Senate Bill 5 would save $1.3 billion. But only about $200 million of that $1.3 billion in alleged savings would accrue to the state, meaning that it would do next to nothing to close Ohio's $8 billion deficit. Nevertheless, many who testified in support of Senate Bill 5 during hearings before the Senate Insurance, Commerce, and Labor Committee claimed that collective bargaining for teachers has led to, and I'm quoting, costs that are spiraling out of control, end of quote, and that with collective bargaining, and I'm quoting again, there is no incentive for teachers' unions to compromise on the issue of wages, end of quote. But the facts tell a very different story. Take teachers' wages, for instance. Between 2008 and 2009, as the study says, which was the worst year of a recession, teacher salaries nationally rose by an average of 2%. In Ohio, teacher salaries dropped by an average of nearly 4%. In only 2 states did teacher pay drop by more than it did in the state of Ohio. What's more, our research found that states which ban or restrict collective bargaining for teachers had, on average, higher and more volatile salary increases than did states which require collective bargaining. Indeed, even though states which restrict collective bargaining make up less than 1/3 of all the states, they make up half of the top 10 states for salary increases. And the top 3 spots were all reduced teachers' rights states. And remember, Ohio's nearly 4% drop in salaries came through collectively bargained agreements. So much for the idea that Ohio teacher salaries are out of control. So much for the idea that under collective bargaining law, Ohio teachers have no incentive to compromise. So much for the idea that drop in salaries came through collectively bargained agreements. So much for the idea that Ohio teacher salaries are out of control. So much for the idea that under the collective bargaining law, Ohio teachers have no incentive to compromise. So much for the idea that teachers are not willing to sacrifice. Nor is it just on wages, our study found, where Ohio teachers have shown that the current collective bargaining law works. They also endorsed a landmark education reform law, House Bill 1, in the last Ohio General Assembly. Among other things, that law, 1, more than doubles the years needed for tenure, makes it easier to fire ineffective teachers, allows for layoffs in cases where school districts are facing bad financial hardship, includes student achievement as part of a new and nationally acclaimed student-teacher evaluation system. In other words, on issue after issue, and under the current collective bargaining law, Ohio teachers have partnered with state and local governments to reform our state's education system and to streamline its costs. Obviously, much work remains to be done, and our report lays out 7 concrete ideas, or what we call opportunities for innovation, for further reform and cost containment. But the point is that Ohio's current collective bargaining law is working. And the point is that Ohio teachers are willing to sacrifice and make needed reforms. How do we know this? Because they've already done it, to the tune of $150 million during 2008 and 9. So if repealing or weakening the state's collective bargaining law will do very little to close the state budget deficit, and if teachers are already agreeing to the kinds of reforms that are needed to improve the system, then what's the real motivation behind the drive to weaken and erode the current law that has worked and avoided labor strife since the Reagan administration? Well, for many people, it's hard to escape the conclusion that what this attack on collective bargaining is really about is politics and ideology, not facts. Ideologically, it's no secret that many conservatives have openly and publicly expressed hostility to unions, and now may feel they have the votes necessary to undermine them. Now, I know that over the weekend, Governor Kasich again said that he was not, and I quote, anti-union. But there are a lot of teachers, for example, that find that statement, that he's not anti-union, hard to square with then candidate Kasich's remarks in March of 2009 when he was speaking in Ashtabula and expressed his desire to, and I quote, break the back of organized labor in the schools, end of quote. Now, we also know that Governor Kasich has recently said that efforts to dismantle collective bargaining is not political payback or born of a desire to punish any group of citizens who did not generally support or vote for him or many of his colleagues. But again, remember, it was Governor Kasich himself who told the Cincinnati Enquirer on November 3rd, and I quote, "Maybe the teachers ought to take out a full-page ad apologizing for all the things they said about me during the campaign," end of quote. Our view is that change should be about proper policy, not politics or paybacks. And in the case of collective bargaining for teachers, the facts simply don't support the claims of those who say we need to change Ohio's collective bargaining law or policy. So, with that, that's the intro to the public policy document that you have in front of you. We also have Steve Dyer here, who was introduced earlier. Steve is an acknowledged expert on education policy, spent a lot of his time on that during the last legislature. Both Steve and I and Janetta will be happy to take whatever questions you may have regarding the study.
You know, you mentioned percentage decreases, but how do we know from this, I can't see in this document, how do we know Ohio teachers weren't making more than everything else in the country to begin with?
Well, actually, according to the same database, I used the Bureau of Labor Statistics OES database. And I looked at kindergarten, middle school, high school, and elementary school teachers. And if you actually look at it, Ohio ranked anywhere from 20th to, I think the highest was 13th, highest in the country, so we're right around middle of the pack. And in fact, Virginia, which bans collective bargaining for teachers, has a higher average teacher salary than we do. So, you know, if we're in the middle of the pack, getting rid of collective bargaining does not necessarily mean your salaries go down. So, you know, I think that the overall impact of that is that, you know, these reforms, and I encourage you to read what the Race to the Top reviewers said about our reforms on teacher evaluation, the willingness of teachers to sacrifice, I think, speaks for itself, and frankly flies in the face of the idea that you need to get rid of collective bargaining to achieve real cost savings. I think all you need to do is sit down with teachers across the table and bargain.
Teachers are already, or even under the new collective bargaining law, going to be allowed to negotiate for wages. A lot of the criticism has been about the other benefits, health care and so on. Have you looked at any of that?
Sure. As you know, during the School Funding Advisory Council process, one of the subcommittees that was convened was to look at teacher compensation, and I was sat on that committee along with others. And one of the things that teachers, administrators, and frankly everyone on that subcommittee, which included, I think, Mike Dawson and a couple of other people from, I think the representatives from teachers and representatives from administrators, what we all agreed to, and the groups in the audience also agreed to, was that 24% was a fair representation for the calculation on benefits, 24% of salary. Now, if you look at the national compensation data from Bureau of Labor Statistics, the national average across all industries is 10%. And if you look at the national average for teachers, it's about 29.4%. And so, you know, again, this is something that is very clearly being, you know, we just had this analysis done during the School Funding Advisory Council. Now, again, there's talk of getting rid of that, but during that process where we heard from everybody, it seemed like in creation on this issue, the 24% was the number that was arrived at, and so I think that that's, you know, that seems to be the that's under the national average for all industries.
On the student achievement point, your second bullet point, can you explain what you're basing the student achievement on, and can you just explain what's behind that?
Yeah, the student achievement is based on the K-12 achievement. Hope no one had an earplug in there. That's based on the K-12 achievement part of the annual Education Week rankings. And what those show is that states that none of the top 10 states have reduced teacher rights. In other words, all of the top 10 states on the K through 12 achievement for Education Week require collective bargaining. Conversely, 7 of the bottom 10 states on achievement either ban collective bargaining or make it restricted. So, you know, there's absolutely no evidence that getting rid of collective bargaining improves student achievement. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence suggesting that getting rid of collective bargaining will hurt student achievement. And that's, you know, we can ill afford in this new economy, this world economy, to let our children fall behind like that simply for political purposes.
What about the idea that, you saw the numbers that were in the dispatch from the collective bargaining office, $1.3 billion could be saved by putting Senate Bill 5 in action. Do you think that that's the case? I mean, that doesn't seem to be what you're saying.
Well, there are a couple of issues with it, and I'll let Janetta and Dale jump in here too, but a couple of things just jump out right at me. First of all, the employees that it included non-union and union employees as well. In addition, none of those issues that were in there could not be collectively bargained. All of those issues could be collectively bargained. And the majority of those savings are for local jurisdictions. It has nothing to do with the $8 billion deficit that we're facing right now. So, you know, there seem to be some problems with that analysis. And in that analysis, it looked at those three, I think it was 3 areas. It didn't at all say, if you get rid of collective bargaining, here's how much you save. It's how much do you save if you do these 3 things, all of which can be collectively bargained. So let me get over to.
And we are very interested, this is a great example of what I've been talking about, wanting to do rapid response. Unfortunately, though, I don't think that the report was widely distributed over the weekend, and so we just got our hands on it, in fact, this morning. So while it was reported on, we are just able to dig in it as of a couple of hours ago. So that, as Steve said, at first blush there does look to be some concerns with the report. One, that it is certainly a look back that actually counts concessions that you know, the 5 state those who bargain on the state level, the 5 unions, concessions that they've already made, and it's, you know, counting that again and again. That's something that was done through, you know, diplomatic negotiations. So, and it does include employees that are both unionized and non-unionized. So we're really digging through that. Also, there were just unfortunately some false statements in there. Like, for example, it implied that state workers were getting pay increases in this contract. That's not the case, and actually they're taking on average a 3% pay cut through the furlough days. It also talks about the step increases being frozen for half of FY10. That's not the case either. And so we are just trying to peel that back and maybe see a little bit more about what was behind that analysis. But again, we just got it a couple of hours ago, so hope to get to that here immediately.
And let me make one broader sort of comment here. We do not, here at Innovation Ohio, we do not gainsay the idea that we have very difficult financial times now, both at the state level and at the local levels. We understand that there will have to be sacrifices made. We don't argue about that, we don't cavil about that. Our point is simply that, based on past experience, sacrifices can be made through the current collective bargaining system. How do we know that? They have been made already through the collective bargaining system. And if past behavior is the best predictor of behavior in the future, then I think you can reasonably assume that teachers will be willing to make sacrifices. And let me also say this, because this is a very important point. It goes to who we are as an organization. If there is going to be sacrifice, and there is going to have to be, it should be shared sacrifice. And I would like to know, we would like to know as an organization, we know what kinds of sacrifices that they're asking from the middle class. What we'd like to know is what sacrifices are being called for from the wealthy folks in our state. So far as I can tell, there's been none. So far as we can tell, all they've been asked to do is to take another tax cut and prepare for the elimination of the estate tax, which is going to help them even further. So if there's going to be sacrifice, it should be shared sacrifice. It should not solely be on the backs of the middle class and the least advantaged of our state.
Well, so you would not support the estate tax and you would tax maybe the highest income earners in Ohio? Is that what you're saying? Conversely, would you say you would advocate taxing the highest income earners in Ohio and also not getting rid of the estate tax?
We will be looking at the estate tax. In fact, that may be a subject of another study here. We're not suggesting that the estate tax as it currently stands in Ohio is necessarily perfect. It may have to be changed. But to suggest that, I will say again, that the wealthy folks in our state have no responsibility, should not have any sacrifice asked of them, we think is simply flatly wrong. We're all in this together, or at least we should be. And if sacrifice is required, everybody ought to be stepping up to the table and being asked to do something.
If it's not necessarily true that the wages fall when collective bargaining is gone, that does support your point about the budget issue. But it would also seem to undermine your point on why we need collective bargaining. Can you address that?
Well, I think the reason you have collective bargaining is because the same reason you have democracy. Two people on either side of the issue standing at a table, coming up with ways to coming up with agreed to workplace environment. I mean, the collective bargaining process is more than just about wages. It's about fairness. It's about being able to sit across the table from somebody who's making billions of dollars and being on an equal footing with them. And before we decide to take away that tool from middle class families, you know, my grandfather worked 40 years at Firestone. It's the only reason I went to college, because he had a union job. And that's not an unfamiliar story in Ohio. Lots of union labor paid for a lot of college degrees in this state. And to pull that away simply because of a short-term political spat, I think is very short-sighted, because it has provided a lot of opportunity for the children of this state.
And just to follow up on that, I think that what we are trying to say is that what we are not trying to say is never under collective bargaining are there not salary increases. What we are saying is during an economic crisis like we had, you know, in the years that Steve looked at the data, there was shared sacrifice through that collective bargaining agreement. And so if the historic economic crisis is going to be used to justify getting rid of or weakening collective bargaining, we feel like we need to put the facts on the table.
You mentioned before that you were looking at the period when there were cuts taking place. What happened over the last 10 years when it came to teacher salaries? Could this be perceived as a course correction? The last 10 years.
I suppose. I mean, I didn't look at the last 10 years. I looked at the budget crisis that was 08, 09. And during the budget crisis, there was a clear and obvious and frankly, one of the most significant sacrifices teachers made in the entire country was made in Ohio. And, you know, I think that you know, however you want to classify that, during a tough economic time, teachers sacrificed more than nearly every other group of teachers in the country. And so I think that's, you know, that speaks for itself. I mean, you know, go back and look 10 years, I guess you could do that, but you know, what we were looking at is right now we're facing another historic budget crisis. When we faced the previous one, which when we were all talking a couple of years ago was the worst crisis since the 30s. Now we're in another worst crisis since the 30s. The teachers made historic sacrifices and did so more than nearly every other state in the union. And I think that needs to be on the table and discussed.
I think you can also say the same for state workers, and again, I think that's you know, that some of the things that we're going to be looking at in this administration's report is that again, during this last collective bargaining process and negotiation, again, there were sacrifices that you don't need legislation to do, to weaken, that voice on the other side of the table.
Yeah, and let me just say one other thing, and as Steve said, we have not in a systematic way looked back over 10 years, but there is anecdotal evidence around that the sacrifice teachers were prepared to do wasn't just a one-time thing. For example, in Worthington, right here in our part of the state, Worthington teachers agreed to implement a high-deductible health insurance plan that resulted in lower district insurance costs in 2006, 2007, 2008, and 2009, and 2010 than were paid out in the year of 2005. They agreed to double their share of insurance premiums and freeze base pay in their last contract extension. They agreed to changes in the reduction in force and sick leave policies. So again, this is anecdotal, but I'm merely suggesting that even though we haven't systematically looked at it, there is anecdotal evidence around that teachers have been prepared over time, not just 1 year or 2 years, to do what was necessary.